All right. I am going to get us started here. So welcome everyone to another evening lecture with Fraunces Tavern Museum. Remember, if you're joining us virtually and you have any questions during the lecture, you can leave them in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring the Q&A during the lecture, so don't worry about saving your question to the end. If you're joining us in person, you will be able to ask your questions at the end of the lecture as well. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. As always, please note that the views of the speakers are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York or its Fraunces Tavern Museum. And with that, let me introduce tonight's speaker. This Fierce People is Alan Pell Crawford's fifth book. A former US Senate speechwriter and congressional aide, he has published acclaimed books on the era of the American founding and one on Mark Twain. His articles and reviews have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, National Review, and Vogue. He has written for the Wall Street Journal for more than 30 years. He lives with his wife, Sally Curran, in Richmond, Virginia. And with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Alan Pell Crawford. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you. This is the one I'm supposed to speak into. All right. Melissa told you I live in Richmond, Virginia, and I was doing a podcast the other night, and the person interviewing me asked where I'm from, and I said I'm living in Richmond. Before that, we lived in Alexandria, Virginia, and which is just down the road from Mount Vernon. We were about halfway between Old Town Alexandria and George Washington's plantation. It's a fascinating little town because some of the streets there were laid out in 1749, obviously before independence, and they have names like King, Queen, Prince, Princess, Duke, and Royal. Sally and I were married at Christ Church, Alexandria, which Chris, my sister-in-law, remembers, which was George Washington's church. He even had a townhouse in Alexandria. I guess when he couldn't make it back to the plantation, he could stay there in town. It was actually demolished in 1855, but rebuilt in 1960. And I just learned this. In the 1990s, it was rented by Mick Fleetwood of Fleetwood Mac. So when I got very interested in Washington at one point and about the American Revolution. And the more I read and learned, the more questions kept coming up. So in part, this book is a result of my own efforts to answer the questions that kept coming up in my mind. I'd read a good deal of the standard accounts of the Revolutionary War, or as one historian has called it in the title of his book, George Washington's War. And the more I looked at it in that sense, the more confused I was getting. It seemed like if you read most of the standard accounts or what you learn in school, it's a pretty straightforward story. It begins in December of 1773 with the Boston Tea Party. Then there's Lexington and Concord, and then there's Bunker Hill, and then Washington crosses to Delaware. I should have done this. And then Brandywine and Saratoga and Germantown and Valley Forge. And then after Valley Forge, there's Yorktown. But I figured out or realized that the last major battle in the North was at Monmouth, which was in June of 78. And the British didn't surrender at Yorktown until October of 1781. And I was never particularly good at math, but more than 3 years passed between Valley Forge and Yorktown. And I kept thinking, what am I missing? Something must have happened during that 3-year period that actually led to the surrender. And then if what happened during that time was included at all in the standard accounts of the war, it would be confined to a single chapter toward the end, almost as an afterthought. There might be a few pages back there called the Southern Campaign. And about the only accounts of the Southern Campaign that I could come up with were either in biographies or in obscure books, largely from specialists, from limited books of limited circulation, publication, distribution. What puzzled me too was that Washington, as monumental a figure as he was in the war, was actually in the North the whole time. He was in New York and New Jersey. He crossed the Potomac only when Cornwallis had already taken his position at Yorktown. And the French admiral told him that he couldn't keep his ships off of the Virginia coast forever. And if Washington was going to come south, he needed to do so now. Now, I want to back up and make it clear, and I'm going to do so, I hope, in greater depth in a moment, that in no way am I denigrating Washington's role in the war. For reasons I hope to get to shortly, my regard for the man, which was already immense, actually increased the more I learned. And for reasons that I don't think are given sufficient attention, there are dimensions to the Washington's character that are to this day unappreciated. So in trying to figure all this out, I read those books, often not from distinguished academics, but from what struck me for the most part as specialists and hobbyists. Some of the information is in biographies, of course, and in the firsthand accounts of participants in the war like Light Horse Harry Lee and Tarleton. And the writing, for the most part, is dated. It's the writing of the early 19th century. And unless you're kind of strange like me, they're unlikely to charm today's reader. Now, there are reasons that the Southern Campaign is often overlooked, especially these days. And we can speculate about that, about those, and I'm happy to do so when it comes time for questions. But for my purposes, it occurred to me that the standard histories leave out some of the great battles and some of the great characters in the war. They also do not sufficiently convey the extent to which the war in the Carolinas and Virginia and Georgia was a civil war of almost unfathomable ferocity. Readers tell me they were astounded by that aspect of the Revolution, and why not? It shocked Nathaniel Greene. In December of 1780, just weeks after Washington appointed Greene as head of the Continental Army in the South, Greene told Samuel Huntington, who was president of the Continental Congress at that time, that in the Southern backcountry, supporters of independence and opponents of it, Greene said, pursue each other with as much relentless fury as beasts of prey. Men and boys who had not enlisted in the war, Greene said, are frequently murdered as they ride along the road. And great numbers of Tories are waylaying the roads, waiting for unsuspecting victims to appear. Greene told Alexander Hamilton, who was then an aide de camp to Washington, that the division among the peoples is much greater than I imagined, and the Whigs and Tories seem to have, that the Whigs and Tories persecute each other with little less than savage fury. There's nothing but murders and devastations in every quarter. Greene said that it was almost impossible to feed his army because the whole country is in great degree laid waste. And the spirit of plundering made the challenge even more daunting. Civil government had almost completely broken down, and indulge me, I'm going to quote here from my own gripping prose. The ravages of war were obvious almost everywhere you looked. Towns that had been bustling with business before the war had been reduced to smoking ruins. Bridges over the rivers that cut through the countryside had been demolished, preventing armies from crossing from one side to the other, but also made it impossible for fleeing civilians to do so. On farms, fences had been torn down to be used as firewood, and the horses, cattle, sheep, and hogs that they had once confined had been taken away by passing armies or slaughtered on the spot. Fields lay fallow. Farms produced little food. The owners whose farms still operated either found their corn, wheat, cattle, or hogs taken by passing troops or paid for with worthless promissory notes. On plantations, slaves who worked the fields had either gone over to the British or otherwise wandered off. Farmhouses, also commandeered by passing armies, had been plundered of their furnishings and often and sometimes burned, just as churches had been. Neighbors who had been friends and sometimes in-laws were now at war with one another. Widows and fatherless children wandered on country lanes carrying their few belongings with them. Sickness and disease rampant among soldiers and on prison ships quickly spread to non-combatants. Commerce had come to a standstill. Inflation was rampant, and currencies had lost their value. The Continental Congress, what there was of a national government, was effectively bankrupt, getting by on loans from France, as dependent upon this foreign government for money as the army was for supplies. I love this. By 1779, Virginia was having a terrible time getting men to enlist because the state was running low on liquor. In an effort to save grain, the Virginia General Assembly cut the customary ration of 1/4 of a pint of liquor a man per day, and enlistments fell. Some armaments were being produced at Iron Works, one in Richmond, and carried by wagon into the Carolinas, but Benedict Arnold, when he captured the city in December of 1780, put a stop to that, destroying foundries, supply houses, and mills. Arnold, let's not forget, was an American. And in significant ways, the war in the South was, as mentioned, a civil war. And the British, deciding in late 1778 to take the war to the South, were banking on the likelihood that it would be a civil war. When the war in the North had reached a stalemate, the British took the war to the South in the belief, not without reason, that the large numbers of loyalists in Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia would fight the war for them. And there was something to that strategy. We often forget the extent to which it involved Americans fighting other Americans. At Kings Mountain in North Carolina, in October of 1780, the only man in the battle who was not an American was Patrick Ferguson, a Scotsman who commanded an army of loyalists. These loyalists, taking a position on the mountaintop, faced a makeshift force that came to be known as the Over-Mountain Men, men who had crossed the Appalachians from what is today Kentucky and Tennessee. The Over-Mountain Men, who were not part of Washington's Continental Army or part of state militias, this was not uncommon in the war, proceeded to whip the loyalists at Kings Mountain and then went back home. Ferguson had informed Cornwallis that there was no way this swarm of backwoodsmen, as he called them, could beat him, but they did. Washington, who was killed, Ferguson, who was killed at Kings Mountain, had discovered something that other British commanders would discover, and something that made all the difference. They will not fight like gentlemen, whined a British officer with the wonderfully posh name of John Watson Todwell Watson. They fight like savages, eternally firing and whooping around us by night and day, waylaying and popping at us from behind every tree. Now, as I say, I had to disabuse myself of a lot of misleading notions in the course of researching this book. And one of them was that the British were unfamiliar with some of the tactics the Americans were using. Imagine a 1990s History Channel reenactment of a Revolutionary War battle. There will be rigid lines of redcoats marching forward, while Americans in coonskin caps crouch behind stone walls, picking off redcoats with comical ease. Now, during a fellowship at the Boston Athenaeum a few years back, I had the privilege of going through Washington's own books. And in them, I found at least 2 works by British military strategists in which they instructed readers on what one of them, as I remember, called it bushfighting. This involved practices the British became familiar with during the 7 Years' War. Readers were told how two redcoats could conceal themselves behind a tree, emerging one at a time to fire his gun while the other ducked back behind the tree and reloaded. This they called treeing. So the British commanders were not unfamiliar with this way of fighting. The Americans, like those untrained volunteers at Kings Mountain, had just done more of it and were better at it because they were untrained and undisciplined. They did it out of sheer instinct. Now, I said a few moments ago, something that called into question whether or not this was or was not George Washington's war. And while I had to conclude that in one sense it wasn't George Washington's war, in another sense it really was. While it is true that until Yorktown, Washington did not lead troops in the Southern campaign, he did something in a sense even more impressive than that, especially considering the apparent odds against an American victory over what was at that time the most powerful army in the world. And it is tempting to draw some pretty simple-minded leadership lessons from Washington's conduct of the war, tempting because there's great explanatory power in it. Early in the war, Washington told John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress at that time, that for officers in the Continental Army, he wanted men much like himself, who were well-established, prosperous, and as Washington put it, activated by principles of honor. Put differently, Washington wanted men who were already leaders in the community with reputations to uphold. Otherwise, he said, you will have little to expect of them. Washington had no faith in members of militia companies. He wanted professional soldiers, men who were well-trained and well-disciplined. He not only had no confidence in what we would call guerrilla fighters, men like Francis Marion, he had disdain for them. As the war dragged on, however, Washington would come to rely on what we would call self-made men, men such as Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan. He saw what they could do, and his own understanding of leadership evolved. In October of 1781, when he chose Greene to replace Horatio Gates as commander of the Southern Army, he was able to offer Greene little or no guidance on how to prosecute the war. And in what is for me the great moment of this book, judge for yourself, Washington readily admitted it. Here's what he said. Here's what he told Greene. He said, uninformed as I am of the enemy's force in that quarter, of our own or of the resources which it will be in our power to command for carrying on the war, Washington says, I can give you no particular instructions, but must leave it to you to govern yourself entirely according to your own prudence and judgment and the circumstances in which you find yourself. Washington was well aware, he said, that the nature of the command will offer you embarrassments of a singular and complicated nature, but I rely upon your abilities and exertions for everything your means will enable you to effect. Washington would not presume in today's parlance to micromanage the war in the South. It would be up to Greene and his own officers and the men like Morgan to figure out how to win the war in the South or not. If a strategy was to develop, they would have to determine what it would be and to give it form. Washington had the good sense to delegate authority, again drawing on the language of a later day when the situation required it. And Greene and Morgan and Francis Marion and Light Horse Harry Lee and the others accepted the challenge. Now about Morgan. Nobody even knows for sure where he was born or when. By Morgan's own account, he left home at 17, New Jersey claims him, but that's debatable, and headed south. He had almost no education. He drove wagons for more prosperous farmers. He also drove wagons for British General Edward Braddock in his expedition against the French, and there he met Washington. It was when he joined a militia company fighting in Canada that Morgan found his true calling. In recognition of his service, he was promoted to colonel. And more than that, Washington saw such promise in this rough character to make sure Morgan got his own command, and an unconventional one it was. Washington prevailed upon Hancock to give Morgan his own special corps of 500 men who would be exempt from the routine duties of camp life and operate independently. They would even have their own uniform, if uniform is a proper word for what it was they were to wear. It occurs to me, Washington told Hancock, that if you were to dress a company or two of true woodsmen in the right Indian style and let them make the attack accompanied with screaming and yelling as the Indians do, it would have very good consequences, especially if little is known or said about the matter beforehand. Washington also made sure Morgan's men were equipped with scalping knives. Morgan and his men, as an independent company, but also as regulars, acquitted themselves admirably at Saratoga, and then the action around Monmouth, and later on at Cowpens in South Carolina. Morgan would prove to be a remarkable commander of men and a surprisingly astute tactician. Washington's ability to spot talent and to give talented men the authority to act on their own good judgment reminds me of the orders that Benjamin Cleveland, one of the commanders of North Carolina troops at Kings Mountain, gave his men. "My brave fellows," Cleveland told his troops, "we have beat the Tories and we can beat them again. They are all cowards. If they had the spirit of men, they would join their fellow citizens in supporting the independence of their country." "When you are engaged," Cleveland told them, "you're not to wait for the command from me. I will show you by example how to fight. I can undertake no more. Every man must consider himself an officer and act from his own judgment." Now, without pushing the point too far, I would venture to say that there is something peculiarly American in what Washington and Cleveland told their men, and in this country's evolving understanding of leadership itself. It would be an exaggeration, of course, to argue that it was this understanding of leadership that made winning the war against the greatest army in the world possible, but it played a large part. You see it over and over again in the war in the South, in which troops, sometimes with little training and sometimes no official connection whatever to the Continental Army itself, manages against horrendous odds to defeat the British. Over and over, supporters of independence under the command of these self-made men managed to turn their weaknesses into strengths and prevail. Maybe this was evidence of some great insight on the part of the officers, and maybe it was just a recognition of reality. In any case, it worked. I'm thinking again of Daniel Morgan, when in January 1781, he faced Tarleton at the Cowpens. Great numbers of Morgan's men had never faced enemy fire, or scarier still, British bayonets. So he placed the least experienced men in a line far in front of two other lines of battle-hardened troops. And the night before the battle, Morgan went from campfire to campfire, telling these raw troops, some of them still in their teens, what would be expected of them come morning. They would take their position in that front line. Tarleton would charge, and they were to fire their weapons, and then they could leave the field. Tarleton would think they were fleeing, that he had routed the enemy, and charge ahead, not knowing he would be charging right into the guns of the second line of more experienced officers, more or less concealed behind a ridge. Long after I laid down, one of the men recalled, Morgan was going about among the soldiers, encouraging them and telling them that he was going to crack his whip over Tarleton in the morning as sure as they lived. But for that to happen, Morgan said, he had to count on them to do their part, and he would ask only what he knew they were capable of doing. They were not expected to hold their position at all costs. They were to stand their ground until the coats were within 50 paces of their line, then fire once, twice, and if possible, 3 times, then they could fall back. Morning came, and as one of the soldiers recalled, Tarleton's men came on like a thunderstorm, as if certain of victory. When they had come within 50 yards of Morgan's first line, this soldier said it was pop, 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 and then the whole volley. It seemed like one sheet of flame from right to left. More redcoats fell than anyone could have imagined, and before long, once they had engaged with the second line as well as those concealed in the woods behind, they immediately took themselves to flight, the soldier recalled, and they appeared to be as hard to stop as a drove of wild Choctaw steers. Cowpens, like Kings Mountain, was a great victory for the supporters of independence, leading to victory at Yorktown, and in the also too easily forgotten skirmishes that went on in the South for 2 more years after Yorktown. Now, we like to think of the Revolutionary period and the founding of the new nation as a time when great patriotic leaders emerged, and that is true. Many did. We're accustomed to look with reverence at Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, for example, but their contemporaries did not. Henry and Jefferson were both regarded as disastrous wartime governors who failed miserably to protect Virginia from the enemy and adequately equip their own soldiers. The state was able to supply weapons for only 1 in 3 or 4 of its militiamen. And at one point in the war, Virginia refused to accept its own paper money for payment of taxes. When Jefferson's term as governor ended, the legislature named Thomas Nelson to replace him. Nelson, who had been a major general earlier in the war. Nelson was a soldier, which Jefferson was not, and was given near dictatorial power as governor, which Jefferson never sought. Jefferson, having done as best he could in impossible circumstances, then packed his family off to Poplar Forest, a plantation he owned in Bedford County in the West. His political enemies found his departure from Richmond and subsequent movements a rich source of amusement. A sister-in-law of John Marshall's could not contain her enjoyment. Such terror and confusion you have no idea of, she wrote. Governor, council, everybody's scampering. Nothing is more laughable, she said, than accounts we have of our illustrious governor, who they say took neither rest nor food for man or horse till he reached Monticello. This is unfair, but it gives us some sense of the irreverence with which Jefferson's contemporaries viewed his performance as wartime governor, and again, helps us see that period of our nation's founding with greater clarity. Jefferson's reputation has not improved in recent years, which brings us to the whole sorry subject of slavery and the role it played in the American Revolution, especially, of course, in the South. This is an endlessly rich subject, and it is getting a good deal of attention these days for understandable reasons. I mentioned earlier why the Southern campaign is given short shrift in standard accounts of the Revolution. And the fact that so many Southern commanders were themselves slaveholders is an important consideration in the accounts of the war written in our time. Here, though, as in almost everything in life, irony abounds. How is it, Samuel Johnson asked at the start of the war, that we hear the loudest yelps of liberty among the drivers of Negroes? And Johnson, to be fair, was referring in this instance not to Southern officers only, but to Americans in general. Abigail Adams noticed this too, telling John, "It always seemed to me a most iniquitous scene to fight for ourselves for what we are robbing and plundering the Negroes of, who have as good a right to freedom as we have." Now, all this seems pretty obvious to us today. But Edmund Burke, in March of 1775, in his speech on conciliation with the colonies, my title is taken, saw something here that others of less penetrating intellect have failed to see. Burke noticed that, as he put it, the spirit of liberty was greater in the South than in the North, precisely because of the institution of slavery. In Virginia and the Carolinas, Burke said, they have a vast multitude of slaves, where this is the case in any part of the world, those who are free are by far the most profound and jealous of their freedom. Burke said he was in no way intended to commend the superior morality of this sentiment, which as it least as much pride as virtue in it. But I cannot alter the nature of man. The fact is so, Burke said, and that these people of the southern colonies are much more strongly and with a higher and stubborn spirit attached to liberty than those to the northward. In such a people, Burke said, the haughtiness of domination, combined with the spirit of freedom, fortifies it and renders it invincible. And as we have seen, invincible it proved to be. We may wish the sources of this spirit of freedom were other than they were, but wishing will not make it so. I mentioned the beating that Jefferson's reputation took even during the war. But as we know now, his reputation has taken an even beating lately. The one leader whose reputation has remained intact, and rightfully so, I believe, is Washington. I mentioned Benedict Arnold. Everybody always remembers Benedict Arnold and how Washington was so terribly mistaken in his assessment of Arnold's character. This is unfair, I came to believe the more I learned about the war. It is unfair in this sense. Washington was, in fact, a superb judge of character, as the confidence he placed in men like Greene and Morgan demonstrate. Maybe Arnold is the exception that proves the rule, if that is what exceptions do. Now, I've been encouraged by the reviews this fierce people has received and by the response of the general public. I wrote it for the general public, after all, not for specialists or academic historians, as much respect as I have for them. So I was especially gratified by this comment posted on Facebook by one of my own nephews, a resident of New Hope, Pennsylvania, which is, of course, about 10 minutes north of Washington's Crossing. I don't know who Alan Crawford is, this nephew wrote. But I'm really hoping this Southern perspective on the American Revolution is full of high-speed car chases and fun songs with catchy banjo licks, or at least a good barbecue recipe. I haven't discussed this with this nephew, but I don't think he will be terribly disappointed, even if I did neglect to chronicle the little-known Battle of Mayberry and the heroic role played in it by the ancestors of Barney Fife. I'm ready now to take any questions you might have. And I'm always terrified to do that. One critic said I'm a better author than historian, and I think that's true. And I had I spent several years in Washington. And after I'd left and gone to Richmond, after about 15, 20 years, I heard from an old frenemy in Washington, and he emailed me out of the blue and then proceeded to get into a political argument with me. And he got very exasperated quickly, and he said, "Alan, you are nothing but a foppish dabbler." And I said, "John, the word you're looking for is dilettante." And so there are people with an imposter complex. I don't have that. I'm an imposter. So I will do the best I can with questions that I think Melissa is going to conduct that. And
Absolutely. So with that fantastic disclaimer, thank you. And does anyone in our audience in person have a question to start us off? And on Zoom, remember, please do put your questions in the Q&A.
Thank you for the talk and the book. You mentioned several times the Civil War nature of the conflict in the South. In terms of the loyalists, can you generalize or provide any additional color on what motivated them? Was it just an allegiance to the king and the British government, or were there localized issues that motivated them?
I suspect all of that. And I think probably the geography as well, because the people, I think for the most part, the people who remained loyalists were not the elite. They tended to be in the backcountry, and all of these people thought of themselves as Englishmen. And so I think they were the people who seemed most ardent, as Burke suggests, are ardent for independence, tended to be the property people with great plantations on the East Coast, and I think felt the pain of taxation and interruption in trade and that sort of thing. I have not studied that question. That's my suspicions. And so you did find pockets of loyalists in the backcountry to a greater degree than you would find in the Virginia Tidewater, for example. I'm sure there were localized issues, but I think that's probably the broadest, that contains the most. Is that helpful at all?
All right, we have a question from Zoom. We're going to move back to the room. Frederick asks, what was Greene's overall strategy to defeat Cornwallis?
I think it evolved. I think he, in fact, tried to, he understood the value of men like Morgan. And when he was moving his troops from North Carolina up to cross into Virginia, he actually divided his army, which you're never supposed to do that in the face of a larger opponent. So he divides his army. He sends Morgan to the west, and so two groups of the Americans are moving to Virginia, and this creates so the British who are pursuing him are getting farther and farther from their own supplies, which are not only, 3,000 miles by sea, and then they've got to get up through the rivers and to their depots. And so they're getting farther and farther from that. And then Greene gets his army across into Halifax County, Virginia, where they could rest and feed themselves again and then head back. He tried to do what Morgan had done at Guilford Courthouse. It didn't work. But I think the larger question there's a number of things. One is the British are getting in. This was only one of the wars they were in at the time. They were in like wars on five locations in Europe and the Caribbean and Northern Africa, I believe, India maybe. I've got it written down here, but that gives you a general idea. And so this is not the main problem they have on their hands. So the longer it takes, the more complicated it becomes. The patience in Parliament is running out. And I think Greene came to understand the value, as Washington came to understand the value of Greene. Greene came to understand what Morgan could do, and Marion and Lee and some of these others. And so it became a rather multifaceted, without a clear, it became rather improvisational. And I think they saw that could work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Question about whether or to what extent slaves fought either for the Continental Army or for the British side. I know that in your book you have there's a story about someone proposed having slaves fight and people were shocked.
Yeah.
But so, to what extent did slaves fight either on the British side or the Continental?
There was some of that. I don't think it was ultimately consequential. There was early in the war, the Royal Governor Dunmore of Virginia sent out his proclamation encouraging slaves to leave their plantations and become British soldiers. Very little of that actually happened. Dunmore promised freedom to them. And then Dunmore took refuge on a ship off of the Virginia coast with several other ships, a kind of flotilla out there, in which he took a lot of these on board, A lot of people got sick and died. And so there is some of that, but I think, and there's a new book, can't remember the author or the title. There's a book that's just been, I just read a review in the New York Times book review a couple of weeks ago on exactly this question, focusing on Dunmore and his efforts. I don't think, I could be wrong, but I think that there is some fighting that takes place. There is one, Dunmore, I think, created what he called this Ethiopian regiment. Again, I don't think it was a major factor in the war. It's a major factor in the psychology of both sides, what to do about this and what effect it has, as Burke pointed out. But in terms of fighting, there are specialists who know this, and I'm sure there are books on the subject on how enslaved people actually won the war. That's our time. That's the climate of our time, I think. It'd take a lot of persuading for me to think that's actually the case.
More questions from the
Thanks for the talk. Do you know the origins of that sort of linear story that you spoke about at the beginning of the history of the war? When did that start being taught in education?
Well, that's I can say this, that the earliest accounts of the war on from the American side are generally found, what I could find were in biographies. So you've got, it's all seen in the shadow of Washington, understandable reasons. But so to a lot of that, the early histories come out of Massachusetts and New York, and they're in biographies of Washington. Later on, then you get accounts like I think it was in the 1840s, maybe earlier than that. It must have been earlier than that, Light Horse Harry Lee did his memoirs when he was in debtor's prison. And Tarleton wrote it, on the British side, Tarleton wrote his account. So I think there's a number of things operating there. One is, there's also an argument that a lot of the archives in the South that would have been sources for books on the campaigns in the South ended up getting destroyed in the American Civil War. There's wonderful accounts, but they weren't published, of individual soldiers, like the one I quoted who was at Cowpens, and the ones that where they leave their own accounts with the family, and now they're accessible through archives and online and all of that. But you have the accounts coming out of the North, and the accounts in biographies of Washington. So I think that is, that's kind of how it's structured in our minds. And that's what I'm reading this, I'm thinking, what happened here? You've got Monmouth and Yorktown, and you got 3 years, something must have happened there. And to find that out, you have to dig deep.
Would the newspapers in the North have been covering this, and then maybe as they got into the more rural areas, there was less?
That's a great question. The answer to which I don't know, but it makes perfect sense that you've got papers in New York and Boston, Philadelphia that are covering the war such as they could. And yeah, and if there's a battle in Northwest Georgia, no one knows except you. Wait, Chris, I look forward to your book.
another question on Zoom. Who asks, why did Cornwallis march to Virginia? What was his big picture goal?
His big picture goal was to catch the Americans and destroy them. And he never could do it. And part of that, I think, is there's all kinds of reasons. One would be knowledge of geography. And they're also going through enemy territory. And if Morgan gets, if Greene and Morgan get there first, the food supplies are consumed, right? So they know where they're going. The British are just chasing them. They're chasing them and dividing to follow too. So it's motive is such a hard thing to pin down. But that all you can do is look at what happened and say, there's a great American historian, David Hackett Fisher, who's written a book called Historians' Fallacies. That's fun because he analyzes tremendous numbers of historical texts. And he says at one point, I see this more in our time than then, but he says, most historians don't try to figure out what really happened. They want to find out who they can blame. And again, that gets the questions of motive, but I think he's driving the British farther and farther from the coasts and farther from their supply lines along the rivers. And they're getting weaker and weaker as they go. And then Greene can take his troops across the river into what we think of as South Boston, and they can rest and replenish themselves, and then head back. And by the way, it's Light Horse Harry that he wants to leave sooner than the other. He's going to cross back over and fight and does, but they regained their spirit and they're rested and fed themselves well, because Virginia at that point, that part of Virginia hadn't been, the crops were still good and there was plenty to feed them.
So do we have a final question from the audience in the room?
After Yorktown, Cornwallis had a continuing career, I think, in British service, didn't he? In other colonies?
Yeah, and so did Tarleton. We think of them as big losers, but they were not regarded as such in England. And they went on to have, one of them was governor of India, whatever that title would have been. And they go on to respectable lives.
And Greene kind of washed out, I think, as a planter.
Yeah, I think so. That's right. Yeah. He got a plantation in Georgia, I believe, the people of Georgia gave him, and died there. Some people, after they've done their big thing, it's like asking a Hall of Fame baseball player, what did you do after that? So, and as I said, Light Horse Harry Lee wrote his memoirs in debtor's prison. And then he went off to, I can't remember which of the islands in the Caribbean, and drank himself to death. And then he's just known now as that father of that terrible Robert E. Lee. So he's a great character. He's got a spree about him that I think is contagious. I like him.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, I think we will wrap up the Q&A. So there's some time for book signings. So I'm just. All right. So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, and thank you all for joining us here tonight. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture and would like to stay up to date with all of our programs, you can join our mailing list by going to FrauncestavernMuseum.org. That's also where you can find our calendar of upcoming programs, including our walking tours and other events. And thank you to those of you who have donated to the museum as well. Your generous support helps us fulfill our mission and share the history of the American Revolutionary era with the public. If you would like to donate, you can also do that on our website, FrauncestavernMuseum.org. Thank you again for joining us at another Fraunces Tavern Museum lecture, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.